So I am not expecting anyone here to have any prior knowledge of the Baha'i faith. So this talk is not assuming you've been to any previous gatherings we've had, but I did want to, for those who have been to some of them, just sort of recap the story arc, as it were, of where we've been. So a few months ago, we were talking about humanity's development over time and how the messengers of God assist in that development, and all of these messengers, how they link together into one larger purpose, moving humankind through its spiritual evolution toward maturity. And then after that, we had an evening where we talked more about the human condition, our soul, what's necessary for its development, and how religion has always played a role in that development. And then a little bit about the life to come, that this isn't all something that just begins here and ends here, but again, it's part of a much, much larger tapestry. And religion is our doorway into having knowledge of that tapestry. And so tonight, I kind of wanted to get more down to earth. So not so much these deeper mystical truths, but some practical ones, some social realities that we face today, and that the Baha'i faith is presenting us some solutions to. Because one of the roles of religion is to help human society progress forward. And society is also as much a material thing as it is a spiritual thing. So let me pull up some slides for you. Okay, so I called this a religion for the modern age. I also, another title I was thinking of was mysticism for the modern age. But the idea being that I want to look at the Baha'i faith as a religion with respect to the needs of our modern times. And when I say the modern age, I just looked some quick quotes online that I found that sort of gave a little bit of the gist of what I mean by modern. And so some of these quotes I found said, "No country can be totally self-sufficient. In today's global economy, a need exists for international trade." And how different that was back thousands of years ago, when there was international trade, but it was always to embellish commerce or provide exotic and rare goods from other places. There wasn't this complete interdependency where one nation would starve or be unable to produce its own goods without the assistance of another. The miracle of instantaneous communication. I think we're all sitting right now in the classic example of that. We can all know what's happening all around the world as soon as it happens. Technology is changing how we live. Technology has really become a huge driver for both change and innovation in a way that it never was in the past. I mean, there was always invention, but society was not moving forward solely based on the rapid pace of invention the way it is now. And life expectancy has increased dramatically around the globe. This is very much a modern condition. You know, way back in the days, people would only live to their maybe 40s, maybe their 50s, but now the average life expectancy, depending on the country that you're in, is much, much higher, which again presents different challenges socially and how we cohere as groups. So all of these modern conditions, which are in a way very much new to the last, say, 100, 150 years, come with a lot of modern problems. And just some of these problems, I'm not going to speak about all of these problems, but some of these have to do with racial justice, economic stability throughout the world, the education of youth, world peace, climate change, dealing with large-scale waste, energy production, and misinformation. These things are, in a lot of ways, the negative outcome of some of these modern conditions, as well as all the positive things that have come from those modern conditions. They also have presented many challenges. So why do I see religion fitting into this puzzle of how we deal with our modern age? So to me, religion, if I were to sum it up in kind of a general statement that I think is applicable to most religions, most belief systems that call themselves religion in the world today, I would say that religion is a belief in some power or truth beyond what is measurable, and a set of guidelines for aligning ourselves with that truth so as to conclude our lives in the highest state of fulfillment. Now, of course, what that truth is, what those guidelines look like, what it means to be fulfilled, these can vary widely depending on which religion that you're looking at. But I think that this maybe generally fits all of them. But in the Baha'i view, religion is sort of this, it's this means of educating humanity about its spiritual reality. So we have a physical being, a material being that we share with the animals, that we share with all the rest of the world that we live in today. But we also participate in a spiritual world and a spiritual reality, which we cannot see and our instruments cannot measure. So we can't have any knowledge about it because none of us have gone there and come back to talk about it. So God sends messengers who act as these intermediaries between us in this material realm and that spiritual realm, because they interoperate, they interact with each other. One metaphor that we used in a previous session was the embryo growing in the womb of a mother, because the embryo is in there and developing and has its own perception of reality. It has its own needs that are local to their being in the womb. It needs all that fluid and blood and stuff like that. But it's within a larger world, and that larger world is actually highly involved in the life of that embryo and the development of that embryo to the embryo's complete unconsciousness. Like the embryo doesn't know anything about it. Now, the embryo, as it turns out, doesn't need to do anything other than just sitting there to develop in the ways that it needs to develop. But what if will was involved? What if there were choices it had to make and it needed to make informed choices? Then you might want to put a little message in a bottle and stick it in and tell the embryo, hey, make this choice, not that choice. Be aware that the future coming up has these attributes and these qualities, and you should be aware of that when you consider what you're going to do with your life. And so God has sent us that message in a bottle, because this is like a womb world too. But here in this womb world, we do move forward by will. We do make choices, and we do pattern our behavior on what we know and understand. So the messengers of God and religion are this way of giving context to our lives, a spiritual context. And the whole rest of this presentation tonight will be about that spiritual context and looking at today's modern problems in that light, and how the Baha'i faith does so specifically. I also wanted to bring up this other word, which is spirituality. Nia, who had popped up, I think she's listening with Nima now, but she asked a great question today. She said, what is spirituality? And I was thinking about that, and it's really not a super easy question to answer, but I think spirituality and religion, they relate. I don't know if they're the same thing, but I think they're definitely intimately connected. And one thing is that, as I said, we're both material and spiritual beings. And I think every single human being, no matter what they believe, no matter what they're a member of, they have that spiritual side to themselves. And whether they're conscious of it or whether they call it by a certain name or not, it's there. And personally, I think that one of the ways in which we all first come into contact with that spiritual side of ourselves is either in childhood, when we have a lot of that chaotic freedom that gives us a great sensitivity to life, or art. Art is this experience that we all have in common, where we experience something that seems more than just this crude physical matter that we're a part of. I mean, what animal builds its shelter just because the place where it is beautiful? So there are these aspects of human beings that I think are very spiritual, and that's universal. And then religion is sort of it's a means by which we can become keenly aware of that spiritual component to ourselves and intentionally develop it. The other thing I wanted to mention about religion is that there's religion, and then there's how humanity receives religion, which can be a very different thing. Sometimes people refer to this as religion and church. And what church becomes and what people do with the religion that they receive, that can be very different. And that's why a lot of times you see religions splitting up into so many sects, because there are so many different beliefs about what that religion was intended to become and what shape it should take. And so that kind of creates a distinction between what humans are doing with that religion today and what the original message was and what its intent was. In the Baha'i faith, one of the things that we're blessed by today is that the connection between that original message and this Baha'i faith that we're going to talk about tonight is that there's a direct line of connection, sort of this handing down the torch, if you will, from one individual to another to finally an institution where this guidance was uninterrupted. There was not a time when, the founder had left a book and it was simply up to his followers to decide how they're going to build the religion based on that book. In the books of the Baha'i faith, it was actually clearly stated how those structures were meant to be built and evolved. So this is a very, very brief overview of the structure of the Baha'i faith. So the Baha'i faith began in Persia in the year 1844 with this figure named the Bab, a title meaning the gate. And I start my diagram here with God to suggest that God was the impetus behind all of these various messengers who came to humanity, many of whose names we know and some of whose names we don't know, because God has been with humanity the whole time. The Bab came in 1844, and he told us that there was one coming soon after him who would usher in the promised golden age, the time of the most great peace, when humanity would begin to start to realize its full potential and enter the phase of maturity, a phase which is destined to last for many thousands of years after. And that person was Baha'u'llah. Baha'u'llah meaning the glory of God, who declared his faith to all of those who he knew in Iran at the time in 1863. And Baha'u'llah is the one whose writings and whose structures we follow today as members of the Baha'i faith. So Baha'i is deriving from this word Baha'u'llah, where Baha means glory. So Baha'u'llah is the glory of God, and a Baha'i would be someone who is of the glory or follows the glory. And when Baha'u'llah passed away in 1892, he left behind very clear instructions in the form of a written will that was signed and sealed. And this will named his son Abdul Baha, the servant of the glory, as his successor. And that not only was Abdul Baha to be his successor, but he also was given the power to interpret the meaning of Baha'u'llah's writings. And this is a very powerful station in the Baha'i faith, to be an interpreter, because no one else other than two of the individuals on this slide have that capacity. No one living today has the right to interpret or to state what the writings mean. Everything you hear me say about the Baha'i faith is my own understanding, and not in any way authoritative or even necessarily the full meaning of the thing I'm even talking about. I'm sharing with you my understanding and what I've gleaned from it. So Abdul Baha, when he passed away, he too left a will and testament, and he named his grandson Shoghi Effendi as the individual who should lead the Baha'i faith. And that individual, Shoghi Effendi, was a member of an institution called the Guardianship, where he was the first, and as it turned out, because he had no descendants, the last of the guardians of the Baha'i faith. And the guardian had the role of shepherding and leading the whole Baha'i world forward in its advancement. He also had the ability to interpret. So when, and it's interesting too, because the way he used that ability to interpret, he didn't write books explaining Baha'u'llah's or Abdul Baha's writings, but he translated. He translated enormous volumes of Baha'i writings, and in those translations, you can feel and sense his interpretation. If you read sometimes the original language that Shoghi Effendi had translated, he might add words in that weren't there in the original, but he had that ability to do that. And we still use his writings today as a guideline for how to translate. And then when Shoghi Effendi passed away, he indicated that there should be elected an institution that Baha'u'llah had described in his writings. And Baha'u'llah said this institution was meant to come into being and to guide the Baha'i world. And that was the Universal House of Justice. And we're very honored here in that Hooper Dunbar is a retired member of that body. So he was on the Universal House of Justice. And the Universal House of Justice, while not given the authority to interpret Baha'i law, Baha'i writings, that ended with Shoghi Effendi, the Universal House of Justice does adjudicate. They decide applicability. They tell us when a law is applicable or not applicable and how. So they give us this guidance for the whole Baha'i world that as all the decades follow, we know that they are inspired in that way, and that's special to the Universal House of Justice. And we call that branch of the Baha'i administration the rulers, because they have authority, but they don't have that authority as individuals. There is no clergy. Any authority that exists in the Baha'i faith is always held by a consultative body of at least 9 people, and 9 people who are elected by secret ballot. At the same time, we have another body called the learned that is composed of individuals, but these individuals always are appointed by the rulers, but they have no personal authority. They cannot tell Baha'is what they should or should not be doing, but they consult, they study, they confer with the rulers to make their decisions. So that's like very quickly a very broad overview of the Baha'i faith's administrative structure and how we socially organize. Underneath these institutions, there are sort of a replication of the rulers and the learned at the national level, at the regional level, at the local level. So many of the Baha'is who are here on this Zoom, some of them may be members of local spiritual assemblies, which are houses of justice for their own cities, or people who are what we call assistants, who are members of the learned also at that local level. Are there any questions after I just deluged you with all of that information?
Could you just differentiate a little bit about the difference between the rulers and the learned, and the learned are more individual?
Yeah, great question. So the rulers are always elected bodies. They are at least 9 people in size, and they come about to their decisions by consultation. And Baha'i consultation is its own thing, which I could give an entire presentation on, but it is a method of including spiritual principles in the process of dialoguing to come to a common agreement or understanding. But no one person can speak for that body unless they're relaying something the body had all in agreement decided to do. The learned are appointed individuals who do not possess individual authority. They learn what's happening in communities and report back. They study all of the guidance coming from the various institutions so that they can share that guidance with other people. They consult with individuals who have questions or difficulties or concerns. But the authority always rests with these consultative bodies among the rulers.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay. I got a question in chat from Sue, but she asked me to make a clarification that when I was talking about religion here, I wasn't speaking of any one religion in particular. So this was not about Christianity or Buddhism or Islam or anything like that. This was about religion in general. So religion is, in a way, you could say it's a spiritual institution that allows humanity to thrive in both our material and spiritual capacities. And there are many, many religions on the earth. So when I had past presentations, I gave a lot of quotations from Baha'u'llah. This presentation is going to be unique in that there aren't many quotations from Baha'u'llah in this presentation. There will be a lot from the Universal House of Justice, because I want to share with you what some of this recent guidance from our world governing body sounds like. So this is something that was written, I believe, in 1986 in a document called The Promise of World Peace. And I really enjoyed how it kind of summed up the role of religion in human life. I'm wondering if, Sue, would you be willing to read this?
Sure. The endowments which distinguish the human race from all other forms of life are summed up in what is known as the human spirit. The mind is its essential quality. These endowments have enabled humanity to build civilizations and to prosper materially, but such accomplishments alone have never satisfied the human spirit, whose mysterious nature inclines it towards transcendence, a reaching towards an invisible realm, towards the ultimate reality, that unknowable essence of essences called God. The religions brought to mankind by a succession of spiritual luminaries have been the primary link between humanity and that ultimate reality, and have galvanized and refined mankind's capacity to achieve spiritual success together with social progress.
I don't think I could have summarized it any better than that. So I kind of wanted that to be the centerpiece of this discussion about religion and how it relates to our development as human beings. This idea that we have a human spirit, and that human spirit has its own longings. And how are those longings fulfilled? And religion offers us the keenest method for its fulfillment. Now, when I was growing up, I had a very different experience of religion than I'm sharing with you this evening. I guess I would say, an unwilling Christian. I grew up as a Methodist, and I did go to church every Sunday. I went to Bible school. I actually really liked Bible school. That was my favorite part of it. The only part I think I didn't like was just sitting and listening to the sermon, because I couldn't really relate to it being 10 years old. But when it came to some of the concepts like saying prayer or fasting for Lent or virtue or ethics, those types of things, I had a difficulty with them because I always felt that they were just constraining me. I couldn't really appreciate why they were constraining me. I only felt the constraint. And so it was kind of, I realized as I thought about it that it kind of reminded me what my experience of high school was like. So I remember in 11th grade, I was in an English grammar class, which I hated. I think I hated it more than any other class I ever went to, which is weird if you knew me now, because now I love English grammar. I can't get enough of it. But back then, as a young person, I didn't appreciate the value of grammar. It was presented to me as valuable knowledge, but I experienced it as a set of arbitrary rules at odds with my intuitive understanding. It's like, well, hey, I know how to speak. I know how to talk to my friends. What does it matter what a participle is or what a past predicate, adjunct, whatever is? But I didn't see that it was something valuable. So I just endured the homework and the tests to get beyond them. I saw these tests as something that I just had to grit my teeth and get through. And then I would be free of them once I could get out of high school. But as an adult, I came to understand that my intuition was meant to give way to instruction, because I didn't know everything. I didn't know that I didn't know everything, but I didn't. And the homework and the tests were actually foundation building. And they existed so that the teacher could help me. Because through the vehicle of taking the tests and sometimes failing, doing the homework and reciting it in class, then the teacher had a keen ear to hear where I was having trouble, where I needed help, which lessons needed to be embellished. So these tests and this effort, this homework, they weren't really about me. They weren't about measuring my ability. They weren't about giving me a gold star. They were a tool between me and the teacher to help the transmission of knowledge. So the grades were never the objective. In the end, the only person those grades helped was me. But I didn't appreciate how they were helping me. You see, I didn't see that larger context in which all of this was happening. So too in religion, we also receive these tests and difficulties throughout our life. Situations that challenge us, situations that summon us to the extent of our ability. And it can very much feel like I'm being tested or measured, right? What's my grade gonna be when I end this life? Is God gonna give me a star? Is he gonna think that I was a good person? But I think it's very much like this. Again, my own understanding here, but I think it's very much like this. He has a thing to teach me, and he's trying to find out what is the means by which I will hear that teaching. And the tests basically are signaling what I'm ready for. Because would it be fair to give somebody a lesson when you hadn't tested them to see where they were at? The other aspect of religion that I personally am very fond of, those who have seen me before know I talk about this a lot, is mysticism. Okay, that's really what got me into the Baha'i faith and kept me in it for the longest time. And this is my own definition of what I think mysticism is. It is framing what is seen in the context of what is unseen and guiding our thoughts and actions from this perspective. So there are many things in this life that are seen that have a bigger, larger context around them, a context that includes spiritual reality and spiritual elements. And if you don't take those spiritual elements into account, then even the material thing is hard to fully understand and put in its right place within your life. And this is going to be important when we look at all these modern problems, because a lot of these problems are connected to spiritual realities. It just may not seem clear or obvious at first. So how do we do this then? How do we take this mystical, like deep aspect of religion that connects us intimately with our creator? And how do we bridge the gap and make this part of our vibrant social life, our way of building community? So the Baha'i faith has a very specific task it has assigned to itself to achieve this. And we call it the institute process. If you ever hear those words among Baha'is, the institute process, it basically is a summary of approaches to creating and interweaving these mystical spiritual realities and teachings with our fundamental, with our everyday present reality. So one is, of course, community devotional gatherings, devotions, prayers, saying prayers together, saying prayers for each other when we're going through difficulties. Or, for example, Marjan, who knows, I don't know if you said it was your brother or your brother-in-law who had passed away on Wednesday. Please remind me, Marjan.
Brother-in-law, Behdad.
Brother.
Yeah, brother-in-law, yes.
So her asking us for a prayer, inviting us to participate in that spiritual remembrance of him together through prayer. This is part of the matrix of community and how we build up connections with each other. It may seem simple at the beginning, but it is a bedrock. The educational programs are part of the institute process, specifically those for children, youth, and junior youth, because they are at such an impressionable and open age. There are also educational programs for adults, but they're aimed more not so much at knowledge as building capacities. And these are capacities specifically intended to advance this whole institute process through the participation of all of its communities all of the community's members in the community building process. So, for example, book one, as they call it, Ruhi book one, one of the capacities that it builds is the ability to elevate conversations by including spiritual dimension. And it does this by looking at prayer, the afterlife, and I'm forgetting now what the third category is. I'm sure that somebody here can remind me.
Spiritual attributes.
Spiritual attributes, right? Virtue. And so when you can have a discussion about, I don't know, how the community is going to irrigate its fields, and you can mention spiritual principles when talking about fairness or justice, or how funds should be allocated, or how the proceeds from that activity should be distributed, it elevates that rudimentary physical discussion to a spiritual level. So that's a capacity that we can all acquire and improve all the time, for example. But this book, book one, specifically focuses on this aspect of community development. And there's a whole bunch of books in this series that deal with things like economic development, that deal with racial justice, that deal with education or becoming an educator. Another are social and economic development projects. So getting involved in a community with the development of its material well-being. And finally, engagement and social discourse. So these are these three ones: education, social and economic development, and engaging in social discourse. Those are sort of like the top three headings of the institute process and the ways that Baha'is are meant to engage in developing our communities. And in fact, if you're interested in that process, there are some conferences that are beginning very soon. And I know there's even one in Marjan's area. There are one in a lot of our areas. There's one here in Sacramento. There's one that's going to be near Chico, and another one in Yolo County. And those conferences are open to everyone, Baha'is or non-Baha'is. I mean, our aim here is the well-being of society. So it's not a Baha'i society that we're talking about. It is just society. And so everyone is invited to join these conferences. Marjan, do you know what dates your conference is happening on?
Yes, ours is gonna be in Lincoln. It's gonna be on May 21st.
May 20th.
And yeah, I can share the address, and the lunch is provided, and but we need people to register, and so we are prepared for the food, and because then there are going to be breakout sessions to for people to discuss the themes, the different 5 themes that we're going to cover. So yeah, so everybody is highly encouraged to sign up, and they're most welcome to bring kids and junior youth and youth. They're going to have their own program as well.
I would like that info, Marjan. The one that's
Okay, I'll
happening
put
in my
it-
city, I can't attend. So I think I would like to come to yours.
Okay, I'll put it in the chat.
Thank you. Yeah, actually talking about these conferences just reminded me that when I was saying that part of the whole mystery of religion is how humans take it on, like what people do with that religion. And I meant to reflect upon the fact that historically, one of the things that has often happened with religion, and sometimes this is actually part of the religion, it depends on when and where in the world it came into being. But that religion is often meant to serve the needs of the community of people to which it came. It's very much about either an individual and their salvation, their standing before God, their ability to become a part of spiritual reality, or keeping that community safe from the onslaught of the world. Like it really creates a bulwark against all of these material pressures that in many ways distract us from our spiritual being. But as I said, as we're moving as a species toward this maturity, this entrance into our adulthood, one of the aspects that has changed about religion is that it's not just for now a certain few. It has always been a global process. It has been for humanity, but humanity was never connected like it is now. A religion that came to India 3,000 years ago, those people there, that whole society and culture, that was just in India. It was much more local in the world at that time. Whereas now by Zoom, you could attend a Zoom in India tonight if you wanted to. So this Baha'i faith, although there are Baha'is, we do ascribe our belief in this faith and commit ourselves to it. But what we're doing as Baha'is is not just for Baha'is. The intent is for the whole community. And that's partly what these conferences are about too. So I want to now dive into, thank you for that registration link. I'm going to click on that now so I don't forget. So let's look at some of these things that we're dealing with in the world. I'm going to pick my first 4. So racial justice. This is one that is affecting us very keenly here in the United States. And we're seeing just ever more manifestations of our lack of this racial justice and the need to do better here. So I wanted to frame these problems in terms of both their material reality and the spiritual principle at work. So above the line here, the spiritual principle is from the writings of Baha'u'llah. He says, if any man were to meditate on that which the scriptures sent down from the heaven of God's holy will have revealed, he would readily recognize that their purpose is that all men shall be regarded as one soul. I mean, that is the ultimate truth that humanity is evolving toward, that all men shall be regarded as one soul. But what is our present day reality? We are still dealing with the consequences of slavery. And, I've been learning a lot more lately about these consequences. And one of the things that was like very much an eye-opener to me is that for the longest time, I thought that racist ideologies were the cause of the oppression and exploitation of Black people in this country. What I didn't realize is that racist ideologies were created to justify exploitation and oppression of Black people. It's the other way around. We didn't have racism and then racism caused all of this suffering. Instead, there was this abuse of people being sold for labor. And when that happened in a community of morally conscious people, it created this cognitive dissonance. How could we, are they people? Should we be treating them this way? And the answer to that was racism. Racism is what gave that license for people to mistreat people from Africa. And then it just bloomed from there into this whole economic trade between Europe and the Americas. And we're still dealing with the consequences of that. So racism was explicitly invented to moralize our violation of a core spiritual tenet. So Baha'u'llah gave us the core spiritual tenet that all men should be regarded as one soul. The way men were treating each other was the exact opposite of this. So how do you resolve that clear contradiction? You change your belief system. You can either change your actions and treat them as they should be treated, or you can change your belief system and tell yourself, well, based on what I believe, that's okay to do. And that is what happened. And you can track it. It has been tracked back historically to the individual in Portugal who actually wrote the first document at the behest of a king, specifically laying out the argument for racial superiority of white people over black people, and thus why they should be able to own slaves. But the spiritual thing here is, how can any person be said to love God if he does not love his children, if he does not love the people that God has made? And this is what makes this problem so vital and essential. If we are to move forward as a people and forward as a species, we can't do so with this contradiction embedded at the heart of our society. It will tear us apart. And there are even warnings within the writings of Abdul Baha that say that if we don't address this issue, if we don't find an answer to this problem, the streets will run with blood at some point in the future. That is how serious and severe this is. So to approach this solely from the side of looking at racism as a bad thing and trying to erase it, while yes, racism it propagates through these racist policies and processes and behaviors, to only examine and eradicate it from the point of view of a ill-fitted social system is to miss the spiritual side of it. It's to miss the side that, hey, for a few hundred years now, whiteness, so to speak, it has cloaked our hearts and prevented us from having these deep friendships and these deep connections with a whole other side of humanity. It's prevented me, because I can remember in high school, white and black being very strictly divided, and I always felt uncomfortable and I didn't want to bridge that gap. We were all very segregated there. And so I was being kept from a whole richness of experience and didn't realize it, because of what the society had given me. The spiritual principle, however, would have introduced me to that ability to have those relationships. So the spiritual aspect is key. So I brought in some more writings from the Universal House of Justice on this subject. And I am going to ask Cooper Dunbar if he would read this letter, this paragraph.
Racism is a profound deviation from the standard of true morality. It deprives a portion of humanity of the opportunity to cultivate and express the full range of their capability and to live a meaningful and flourishing life, while blighting the progress of the rest of mankind, humankind. It cannot be rooted out by contest and conflict. It must be supplanted by the established just relationships among individuals, communities, and institutions of society that will uplift all and will not designate anyone as other. The change required is not merely social and economic, but above all, moral and spiritual.
And there are two phrases in this paragraph in particular. Thank you, Mr. Dunbar. There are two phrases in this paragraph that really go to the idea that I'm trying to get across tonight, which is this idea that religion has a place in addressing our modern problems. One is the identification that racism is not simply affecting one target group. It is blighting the progress of the rest of humankind. It is doing us spiritual damage. That's part of that larger perspective that I was talking about. And the other is their statement that the change required is not merely social and economic, but above all, moral and spiritual. Until the moral and the spiritual dimensions of this problem are also changed, the social and the economic may change, but they will recur. They transform into ever more insidious forms as we move forward. This next paragraph, who would like to read? I always call on people, but sometimes I don't know if they want to be called on. So who would like to read? Does this mean no one would like to read?
This is Jan. I'll read this one.
Thank you, Jan.
All Baha'is are called to persistently act, little by little, to deliberately cultivate freedom from racial prejudice within our daily lives, within their daily lives, their families, their community building activities, their involvement with society, and all the social spaces in which they participate, so that they increasingly evince the Baha'i teachings, especially the oneness of humanity. If the friends become founts of love and create environments wherein the spirit and the practice of race unity are prevalent, every trace of race prejudice will ultimately be removed.
So now I don't mean by quoting this to suggest that this is the only thing that we should be doing, because if this were the only way in which we were moving forward, it might be a very long road indeed, waiting for every heart to change. But the change of hearts is also integral to this process. And so every single person is called upon to act little by little to deliberately cultivate this freedom from racial prejudice in their hearts. That's just where we have to begin. That's kind of like the ante in the poker game. But we also do have to do much more than this as well. The next topic is economic stability. And what I was reading this book on economics, a textbook on economics, and it was saying that the science of economics is addressing the fact that in a world with limited resources, how do you fairly determine which resources go to which needs? But the world we live in right now is not economically very fair in its distribution. I mean, that's sort of the promise of the free market that Adam Smith wrote about. But instead, in the world that we're living in today, we have a spiritual principle, but then we also have a current problem. Our spiritual principle, again from Baha'u'llah, O ye rich ones on earth, the poor in your midst are my trust. Guard ye my trust, and be not intent only on your own ease. Sort of the opposite of that saying, when Abel asked, am I my brother's keeper? This is saying we should be our brother's keeper. The reality we're dealing with is that there are whole nations starving today, despite the wealth that we have on the planet, despite the amount of food that is produced on the planet. We have whole nations starving, and homelessness is becoming ever worse as an epidemic. And not only that, but homelessness that sits side by side with opulence to a degree that I hadn't even heard of before. Like Sue and I were talking about different kinds of tea. There's a tea at a Hong Kong restaurant right now that costs $138,000 per kilogram. So one tiny cup of that tea is $3,500. So imagine having a cup of tea that would pay rent for someone for an entire year. That's the disparity between wealth and poverty that we have in the world today. But how do we address that? How do we address that disparity? Just simply taking from one group to give to another group, that's been tried before too. But there has to be a spiritual element to this solution. So again, so this time it is from Abdul Baha, and I'm going to call on my wife. Would she like to read from Abdul Baha?
The fundamentals of the whole economic condition are divine in nature and are associated with the world of the heart and spirit. This is fully explained in the Baha'i teachings, and without knowledge of its principles, no improvement in the economic state can be realized.
Now, I assure you, nothing like this statement was in that textbook I read on economics. Here, Abdul Baha is telling us that the economic condition in the world is divine in nature and associated with the world of the heart and spirit. That is unlike any other assessment of the world's economic condition I have ever read. Now the quote continues. Nassim?
This is Senda. I can read.
Oh, go for it, Senda. I thought you were driving.
I just got home, so let's see. When the love of God is established, everything else will be realized. This is the true foundation of all economics. Reflect upon it. Endeavor to become the cause of the attraction of souls rather than to enforce minds. Manifest true economics to the people. Show what love is, what kindness is, what true severance is, and generosity. Economic questions will not attract hearts. The love of God alone will attract them. Economic questions are most interesting, but the power which moves, controls, and attracts the hearts of men is the love of God.
And you find these words in Baha'i writings, even Baha'i writings that are about subjects like economics, coming up all the time about love and heart and spirit. This is sort of our core. This is where our foundation is, and when we try to approach these problems. So at conferences like the one that Marjan mentioned, they will be talking about how the Baha'i faith is seeking to build community in that local area around Lincoln, the larger area around Lincoln. But we're trying to do so with these principles in hand, with this perspective in mind. And I have another quote here. I'm going to call on Alicia. You just knew I was going to do that, didn't you?
The inordinate disparity between rich and poor, a source of acute suffering, keeps the world in a state of instability, virtually on the brink of war. Few societies have dealt effectively with this situation. The solution calls for the combined application of spiritual, moral, and practical approaches. A fresh look at the problem is required, entailing consultation with experts from a wide spectrum of disciplines, devoid of economic and ideological polemics, and involving the people directly, afflicted with the decisions that must urgently be made.
Yeah, and again, they make that statement, a combined application of spiritual, moral, and practical. Another topic, we have just two more, is world peace. And again, from that same message, it's really quite a beautiful message. I'm going to ask Marilyn if you could read this quote. This is the first part. There are two parts to this quote.
So much have aggression and conflict come to characterize our social, economic, and religious systems that many have succumbed to the view that such behavior is intrinsic to human nature and therefore ineradicable. As the need for peace becomes more urgent, this fundamental contradiction, which hinders its realization, demands a reassessment of the assumptions upon which the commonly held view of mankind's historical predicament is based.
And to me, these two paragraphs that are about world peace, they're actually very profoundly relevant to all the other problems we talked about as well. Because when this spiritual context is lacking, people will invent their own context to explain why humans do what they do, especially large groups of humans. So it is not uncommon for people to think that people are inherently biased, inherently inclined towards prejudice, or in the case of economic stability, that we're inherently greedy or inherently seeking our own enrichment at the expense of others. Here in talking about world peace, that we're inherently bellicose or prone to fighting with each other if we don't have some sort of police watching over us. And when people view human beings this way, that like we're just waiting for the cat to go away so the mice can play, that hinders our ability to move forward with the conviction that we can do this. That not only do we have the potential and the capacity to live peacefully together, 7 billion people, but that it is inevitable that we will. This is the promised fulfillment of humankind. There is no default state in which we are warlike, greedy, and prone to advance ourselves over each other. That is a material condition that can result from a total lack of moral education, but it is not endemic to our spiritual nature. Who we are spiritually is more aligned with these other things that we've been reading about: love, altruism, watching out for one another, becoming close enough that we might be regarded as one soul. Like, that's our true nature. And religion is trying to nurture and bring that nature into fruition. Now the quote continues. I'm very happy if anyone notices that I keep the background consistent whenever I'm continuing the quote, but who would like to read this? I'm going to call on Chuck.
With the entrenchment of this view, a paralyzing contradiction has developed in human affairs. On the one hand, people of all nations proclaim not only their readiness, but their longing for peace and harmony, for an end to the harrowing apprehensions tormenting their daily lives. On the other, uncritical assent is given to the proposition that human beings are incorrigibly selfish and aggressive, and thus incapable of erecting a social system at once progressive and peaceful, dynamic and harmonious, a system giving free play to individual creativity and initiative, but based on cooperation and reciprocity.
Thank you, Chuck. And then the last issue I was going to bring up, and I sort of picked these two because you might hear about them in these conferences, or if you attend, if you join a Ruhi study circle, these are ideas that you might come across in those books as well. And the last one is the education of youth, right? And this actually ends up becoming a big problem because there are a lot more uneducated youth in the world today than you may expect. I found from my research that as a result of poverty and marginalization, our present day reality, there are more than 72 million children in the world who are completely unschooled. And think of all that those minds could do. 72 million people. Among those 72 million, the statistical odds that there are multiple geniuses among them are undeniable. You know, I think if a person has an IQ of 160, which was like Einstein, I think that it's 1 in 250,000. So there would be at least 20 people of genius intellect in a group of 72 million. But that is going untapped because we're not able to educate. So I looked for Baha'i writings about the importance of educating youth. And I actually came across this quote from the Baha'i International Community. This isn't one of those institutions that I mentioned earlier on that slide, but this is a group of people that interface with other international organizations. And this document from the Baha'i International Community said that the involvement of youth in this community building process, in the development of society, is not something to be sought for their sake alone, nor a tool designed to advance their needs as a specific population group. Rather, it is a component critical to the well-being of all of humankind. young and old alike. And to me, that's that spiritual framework again. Educating our youth isn't just something we do because youth should be educated. The education of the youth is a component critical to the well-being of the whole of humanity, young and old alike, because they will be the owners of this earth after us. So some of the writings that I found on this, this is from Abdul Baha. And this is, I will ask Paul if he will read this.
The education and training of children is among the most meritorious acts of humankind, and draweth down the grace and favor of the All-Merciful. For education is the indispensable foundation of all human excellence, and alloweth man to work his way to the heights of abiding glory.
There is so much that we need in the future that does not happen in the absence of education. Education is key. And specifically about looking, again, the quote about world peace that said we tend to look at ourselves as inherently aggressive and warlike. Well, this same, the Universal House of Justice later talked about how we view youth and some of the inherent traits that we think youth have. So let me see, I'm going to ask Geeti if she will read this one.
While global trends project an image of this age group, junior youth, as problematic, lost in the throes of tumultuous, physical and emotional change, unresponsive and self-consumed, the Baha'i community in the language it employs and the approaches it adopts is moving radically in the opposite direction, seeing in junior youth listed the altruism, an acute sense of justice, eagerness to learn about the universe, and a desire to contribute to the construction of a better world.
Like when I see youth portrayed in television programs, they're often shown as self-obsessed, only interested in their own immediate concerns, like give them a device and they won't interact with anybody. But in this document from our Universal House of Justice, they have described a view of the youth as they have an acute sense of justice. They are inherently more altruistic. They are eager to learn about the universe. And they have a desire to contribute. They want to do something towards the construction of a better world. These traits are natural to these young people. And if we put those traits foremost, encourage them, recognize them, make them the pivot around which an educational program turns, then they become powerful engines of change for society. So that's, again, it's that spiritual frame around who youth are and what youth are capable of. So that's those modern problems that I wanted to talk about and their respective frames. I did find one last quote, which I thought was a beautiful summary of the Baha'i view of how we're going to move forward. And it's actually a quote about youth. I'll just read it quickly. It's 3 short slides. So the Universal House of Justice in 2010 said that the key to resolving these social ills rests in the hands of a youthful generation, convinced of the nobility of human beings, eagerly seeking a deeper understanding of the true purpose of existence, able to distinguish between divine religion and mere superstition, clear in the view that science and religion as two independent yet complementary systems of knowledge that propel human progress, conscious of and drawn to the beauty and power of unity and diversity, secure in the knowledge that real glory is to be found in service to one's country and to the peoples of the world, and finally mindful that the acquisition of wealth is praiseworthy only insofar as it is attained through just means and expended for benevolent purposes, for the promotion of knowledge and toward the common good. Thus must our precious youth prepare themselves to shoulder the tremendous responsibilities that await them. And thus will they prove immune to the atmosphere of greed that surrounds them and press forward unwavering in the pursuit of their exalted goals. I have one last little closer video for you. So there was a movie that the Baha'i community developed called A Widening Embrace that intended to kind of show how this community building process has been taking place in different parts of the world. And I thought that the intro to it was very relevant to this presentation. So this is 6.5 minutes. If it comes up. One sec, the sharing is not working, so I have to share this differently. All right, let me share the player.
The fundamental purpose, animating the faith of God and His religion, is to safeguard the interests and promote the unity of the human race, and to foster the spirit of love and fellowship amongst men. As the life of humanity undergoes a process of profound change, across the globe, followers of Baha'u'llah, in the company of their friends, are striving with great enthusiasm to put into practice his teachings. Working shoulder to shoulder with neighbors and colleagues, they are learning how to build vibrant and prosperous communities. Communities that begin to reflect a united and illumined new world.
The revelation of Baha'u'llah has the power to transform society. For the last many decades, we've been learning how to take that revelation and apply it in order to effect the spiritual and material progress of society. Around 20 years ago, we reached a turning point. A process that started to unfold was the systematic training of individuals to build their capacity in order to be effecting change in their communities.
ធ្វើឲ្យមនុស្សទូទៅបានភាគច្រើនដែលគេបានឆ្លងកាត់ជាឋានហ្នឹងបានធ្វើឲ្យគេបានកសាងសមត្ថភាពរបស់ពួកគេផ្លាស់ប្ដូរពួកគេទៅជាការផ្លាស់ប្ដូររបស់ពួកគេហ្នឹងគឺការជួយទៅដល់អ្នកដទៃការបម្រើទៅដល់អ្នកដទៃ
we have now this tool, this instrument of limitless potentialities that is helping us to develop our capabilities to actually translate what has been written in Baha'u'llah's writings into very practical action. And maybe then the question before us now is how do we bring more and more friends into this process so that together as a collective we can really advance in our capacity.
Vamos a memorizar una cita. Cita de Baha'u'llah es una cita muy bella que nos va a enseñar a tener un corazón puro. Oh, hijo del Espíritu.
Tunashukuru kwa kufika kuona grupe au sikse gani nyo ushapata depuis sa ulianza fungula grupe yako ya baprejeni.
युवावस्था भनेको चाहिँ यस्तो अवस्था हो जस्तो कि वसन्तकाल जस्तो होइन त्यो अवस्थामा हामीहरू जे पनि गर्न सक्छौँ चाह्यौँ भने युवाहरू होइन अनि जुन युवा भनेको एउटा निर्भीक सिंह जस्तै हो त्यसकारणले जुन हामी युवाहरू हौँ त्यो युवा भइसकेपछि हामीहरू के त आफ्नो समाजको लागि केही न केही राम्रो काम गर्नुपर्ने छ यसको जुन राम्रो नैतिक उद्देश्यको बारेमा हामी उनीहरूसँग कुरा गर्न सक्छौँ.
In October 2017, people from every walk of life gathered in homes and halls, parks and universities to celebrate the bicentenary of the birth of Baha'u'llah.
When I think about the bicentenary celebrations, I think one of the things that we've seen is how ready people are now to speak of the life of Baha'u'llah and of his teachings directly, and how ready people are to hear them. And I think that has been a change.
Baha'u'llah ha traído estas herramientas para realmente transformar nuestras vidas individuales y colectivas. El Bicentenario nos llevó a otro nivel de acción colectiva.
As more and more souls learn to apply the Baha'i approach to building vibrant communities, populations around the world are increasingly spurred into action, learning to take charge of their own development.
Baha'u'llah, además de que nos da ese sentido de propósito, ya como individuos, nos indica claramente cómo podemos cumplir ese propósito en base a las interacciones que tengamos con los demás. Uno ve personas, uno ve grupos, uno ve comunidades donde la llegada, ¿no?, de las enseñanzas Baha'is fue el punto de partida hacia nuevos niveles de mejor calidad de vida.
So thank you all for staying with me this hour and a half. If there's any comments or questions or reflections or experiences that anyone here would like to share, the floor is open. I can see Senda. Hello.
I have one question, John.
Sure.
I wonder, is there sort of a geographical center to the religion, or the headquarters building or offices or something, or is it truly becoming more and more of a global thing?
We do have an administrative center, but it is not by any means where the majority of the Baha'is are located around the world. So the Universal House of Justice does have a seat, a building in which they meet, that is in Haifa, Israel. Oh. And there are several buildings within that city that are used by those international governing bodies. Mm-hmm. But now there are national communities and local communities truly distributed across the entire world.
Yeah, Susan has, oh no, go ahead, I'm done.
Oh, no, go ahead. No, you go first, go ahead.
I was just going to say that Susan has been very helpful in illuminating Baha'i to me and to Leslie as well. So this has been very, very helpful tonight. John, I thank you for your teachings.
Thank you, Chuck. And I agree with the chat that you do have an amazing voice. I would love to hear you reading Baha'i writings. Like if I could have that on tape, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much.
Senda?
This is Senda. I just had a question to ask you. Earlier, you had talked a little bit about what role religion plays in our lives, and I just wanted to hear again what your thoughts were on that.
So religion has a profound role to play in our lives because we are much more than appears. We have an entire dimension to us, which is even far greater than that which is physically visible. And religion is a message from the unseen, so to speak, that gives us concrete information and knowledge about this aspect of our nature. And so it tells us which ways that we ought to be, which things that we ought to know and be guarded against or encourage that will help us develop that side of our nature. So the importance of virtue, for example, the importance of relying upon one another, the importance, the power of love and of prayer, and even of things like fasting. Like some of these may not even make sense in a purely material context. I remember when I was younger thinking that religion teaches us to be to care about other people and to be sacrificing, right? And I was thinking, well, if I'm the one sacrificing and other people aren't, that's great for them. You know, it's like it kind of sets me up to fail if I'm in a community where everyone else is looking to take advantage of me, but I'm trying to be sacrificing. So why is religion throwing me under the bus? Well, then I realized that becoming sacrificial in nature is a spiritual quality that leads to the development of other powers and capacities that we possess as human beings. And so it remains significant and important. It's not only about how it gets us ahead.
Thank you for that.
Sue?
Yeah, and in addition to that, I think, if we think about what really brings us joy, it gives us great joy, I think, to lovingly take a cup of tea to a friend who's tired, or to help someone who is in need. This gives us such joy. And children also experience that joy. And if we teach it to our children, the joy of actually serving others, then their lives and our lives are much happier.
That's a great point. Yeah, definitely our happiness, our joy, our sense of fulfillment, this calling of the human spirit, it is satisfied by things more than what we can buy or acquire. There is another dimension to life. And I can attest that Sue is able to bring spirituality into the experience of drinking tea.
I hadn't even thought of that when I said that.
Well, then I will hand it back to you, Marjan.
You.
Oh, she's good.